Sir, you can't sit here. This seat is for paying customers." The flight attendant sneered, her voice dripping with disdain as passengers turned to watch. The man, calm but visibly insulted, tightened his grip on his boarding pass. First class paid in full. Around them, whispers grew, the humiliation stinging sharper than any delay. What she didn't know, what no one on that crew knew, was that in less than an hour, he would decide all their fates, and they wouldn't like the ending. He was humiliated in front of 100 strangers, publicly pulled from his seat, downgraded, and told with a smile that first class isn't for everyone. All because of the color of his skin. No warning, no apology, just quiet. Practiced cruelty, served at $35,000 FT. They didn't ask his name. They didn't care who he was, and that was their first mistake. This isn't a story about a flight gone wrong. This is a story about what happens when power doesn't wear a Rolex, doesn't announce itself, and doesn't need to raise its voice to burn the whole system down. As the crew mocked him, as passengers whispered, as someone laughed and said, "He should have known his place," they thought they were witnessing another case of a black man pushed aside, another story that would be forgotten by landing. They had no idea what was coming. What started as prejudice turned into something else entirely, something no one on that plane will ever forget. Want to know what happens when the person you thought had no power turns out to own the entire sky you're flying through? Stay locked in. Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and which moment in this story hit you the hardest? We're just getting started. The terminal buzzed with quiet opulence, all marble tile and polished glass, humming with the restrained energy of executives on red-eye flights and private vacationers wrapped in designer scarves. At Gate 22 of the LaGuardia International Wing, the velvet rope separating first class from the rest of the world stood as a silent wall, a line drawn between those who belonged and those who didn't. Darius Langston adjusted his cufflinks, the brushed platinum catching soft overhead lights as he stepped past that line without hesitation. A man like him had nothing to prove. His steps were measured, unhurried, despite the controlled chaos of boarding announcements and suitcases thudding against Io, dressed in a dark slate Bion suit and crisp Oxford shirt. He moved with a quiet assurance of someone used to commanding conference tables and global attention, though no one in the bustling terminal recognized him, and that was exactly how he preferred it. For Darius, anonymity wasn't a limitation, it was a weapon. There was power in being underestimated. But as he handed over his digital boarding pass and the scanner beeped green, he couldn't ignore the flicker of unease that passed through the attendant's eyes, too fast to catch if he hadn't been trained to look for those moments. A smile formed on her lips, a beat too late, just as she waved him forward with a professional nod. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Langston." He stepped into the jet bridge and shook the feeling off his seat. 3A window side left wing was always his sanctuary. No matter how brutal the quarterly pitch meetings in Midtown became, this seat was the line between war and recovery. The first breath after hours spent battling CEOs who were either trying to merge with him or crush him. He made his way down the first-class aisle, the familiar scent of bergamot, aged leather, and pressurized air triggering muscle memory. He counted rows: 1, A2, A3, A taken. A man was already reclined in his seat. Darius halted, confusion flickering across his face as his eyes scanned the number again. 3A, correct. The man occupying it was perhaps in his early 50s, white balding, wearing an expensive navy pinstriped suit, and an air of indifference. He was reading the Wall Street Journal, its front page folded neatly over his knee. "Excuse me?" Darius said, his tone neutral but firm. "I believe you're in my seat." The man glanced at him just barely, then returned to his reading. "No, I don't think so," he said without apology, voice lazy, dismissive. Darius raised an eyebrow, letting silence stretch for a moment. Then he turned to the nearest flight attendant, young blonde, and scanning a tablet. Her name tag read, Rachel. "There's a mix-up," Darius said, passing her. His pass. "Seat 3. Rachel took the pass with an apologetic smile, tapping the tablet a few times before her expression subtly shifted. Her smile dimmed. Mr. Langston. I'm so sorry. There appears to have been a last-minute change in seating. A change? Darius asked. By who the system? She replied too quickly. It happens on rare occasions sometimes to accommodate high-priority passengers. Her tone turned rehearsed, almost defensive. You've been reassigned to a different seat. Where he asked. Economy. Darius stared at her. Incredulous. I booked this seat 5 weeks ago. Paid full fare. There's no reason I should be moved. I understand and I truly apologize. It's just you're telling me that without any warning or consent you downgraded me from first class to economy? Rachel hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir, but... And the man in my seat? Darius gestured. Rachel hesitated again. He's the priority accommodation. Does he have a ticket for 3? He was upgraded at the gate, she admitted. Last-minute request. And you honored that over a confirmed seat? Darius asked. She blinked. It wasn't personal. Darius's voice remained calm, but his words landed sharp. It never is it? At that, a man in 2 chuckled softly, not bothering to hide his amusement. Relax, buddy, he muttered loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. These upgrades happen all the time, not the end of the world. Darius turned slightly, studying the man's smirk. He looked like a hedge fund VP mid-40s pink shirt collar peeking from a Burberry blazer. Somehow, I doubt it happens to you, Darius replied flatly. The man laughed again. Don't take it so personally. Maybe it's a seat mix-up. Maybe it's just standards. That word standards hung in the air like poison. Rachel cleared her throat. Sir, I can offer you 25,000 bonus miles and a complimentary beverage if you'll just take the alternate seat. I'm not interested in consolation, Darius said. He turned to the man in 3A. You gonna give up the seat or not? The man folded his paper and smiled, faux apologetic. Sorry, pal. Got bumped up last minute. These things happen. Darius didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. He didn't raise his voice. Yeah, he said calmly. Activate Article 17, Flight 849, LaGuardia to LAX. We've hit the threshold. He ended the call. Rachel stiffened. Sir, what was that? Darius tucked the phone away. You'll find out in about 3 minutes. And with that, he turned and walked toward the galley. No anger in his stride, just precision, as the whispers spread down the cabin and passengers stared, wondering who he really was. Darius Langston knew one thing. This wasn't the moment he lost control. It was the moment he took aback. He had triggered Article 17, a clause built quietly into every executive acquisition. His firm executed an internal compliance mechanism that alerted Langston Dynamics' legal and PR teams in real time if a SEAL partner encountered workplace bias or discrimination in public-facing environments, while the flight crew returned to their routines unaware that legal engines were already turning behind the scenes. Darius took a slow breath and made his way toward his reassigned seat in row 22, still in his press suit, still perfectly composed but with a shift in the air around him, as if even gravity had begun to bend. When he arrived, his new seat wasn't empty. A toddler's juice box lay crumpled in the seat sticky red, liquid staining the cushion. The man in the aisle beside it, mid-30s, flip-flops, earbuds, Hawaiian shirt didn't move, just offered a lazy shrug. Sorry, kids spilled it. They said they'd clean it in a sec. Darius didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the nearest flight attendant. This one a tall man with angular features and slick back hair. His name tag read, Curtis, Cat 22A is soaked, Darius said calmly. There's a mess, I need it cleaned or reassigned. Curtis blinked slowly, barely masking his annoyance. Let me take a look, he said with a tight smile, then walked over, crouched briefly and gave the cushion a half-hearted wipe with a napkin from the cart. Should be fine now, he said. It's still damp. Darius replied, his tone clipped. Curtis leaned in, lowered his voice. Listen, sir. You're lucky we found any seat at all on this full flight. If it's not good enough, you're welcome to file a complaint after landing." The implication wasn't subtle. Darius looked him in the eye and said nothing. He slid into the damp seat, back straight suitcasing, under tension. Minutes passed. The cabin settled into cruising altitude. The murmurs that had followed him from first class eventually faded. He opened his laptop, custom carbon casing, secure drives loaded with sensitive proposals for an international merger, and began typing, fingers gliding over the keyboard with practiced ease. This was the only time he allowed himself focus. The rest he'd deal with later. He was drafting a clause extension when a sudden cold splash erupted across his left side, an icy sting that soaked through his jacket shirt and across the keyboard. Darius jerked back instinctively, his breath sharp. His laptop screen flickered, then went black. Curtis stood over him, one hand holding a now empty bottle of sparkling water, his expression the perfect picture of feigned horror. "Oh no," Curtis gasped. "I'm so sorry, turbulence must have knocked my elbow. Let me get something to dry that." Darius looked down at his soap jacket, the dripping machine in his lap, and then up straight into Curtis's eyes. There was no turbulence. The flight was smooth, not even a vibration. The pause between the splash and the fake apology was a beat too long, just long enough for intent to slip through. Around him, passengers watched in silence. No one offered help. No one stood. A few turned away as if ashamed, but most simply looked bored. Darius set the laptop aside, eyes narrowing, voice low. "You did that on purpose." Curtis's smile tightened. "Why would I do something like that, sir?" "I don't know," Darius said evenly, "but maybe it has something to do with where I was supposed to be sitting an hour ago." "Sir," Curtis said quickly, "I suggest you lower your voice or I'll have to notify the captain." "You can notify whoever you want," Darius replied. "But understand this," before he could finish, another voice cut in. "Excuse me," said a woman seated across the aisle, blonde, mid-40s, holding a glass of Chardonnay. "Can we keep it down? Some of us are trying to relax." Darius stared at her, the sheer absurdity of her complaint nearly laughable. The man next to her nodded in agreement. "Nobody wants drama, man." Curtis gestured toward the galley. "Let me see if we can find another seat." Darius exhaled. "That would be wise." Moments later, Curtis returned. "There's one seat open near the front. Not quite first class, but lead the way," Darius said. As they walked up the aisle, Darius noticed something. A white couple being ushered from economy into premium comfort seats just behind first class. Smiling, laughing, thanking another attendant. Darius's new seat wasn't among them. He was placed in 10D, close to the lavatory, a broken screen in front of him. As the beverage cart rolled closer, Darius tried to collect himself, tried to summon the version of him that had built Langston Dynamics from a basement lab and turned it into a global powerhouse. But just as he straightened his jacket, the same flight attendant Curtis returned, this time with another crew member, a woman with clip bangs and a tight smile. Her name tag read, Linda Mr. Langston. She said, her voice a little too loud for comfort. "May we speak with you for a moment?" Darius gave a slow nod. "Of course." Curtis stepped closer. "We just need to verify something with you, sir. Standard security protocol." Darius tilted his head slightly. "Verify what exactly?" Linda produced a tablet and tapped through the manifest. "We need to confirm that the name on the reservation matches your identity. Do you have any government-issued ID available?" Darius stared at her, unmoving. "You need me to show ID for a seat that was reassigned to me, after downgrading me from first class. It's a routine check," she said quickly, "just to ensure passenger safety." "Is this same check being done for everyone on board?" he asked. Linda didn't answer immediately. She glanced at Curtis, who suddenly found great interest in the stitching of his uniform. "No one else has been asked." "Have they?" Darius pressed. Linda hesitated, then offered a strange smile. "We've had some discrepancies on past flights." "It's not about you, sir." "Of course it is," Darius said, his voice cool. You're just trained to pretend it isn't. With the entire section watching, he reached slowly into his wallet and pulled out his ID, flipping it open to show his driver's license and global entry card. Curtis leaned forward unnecessarily close, pretending to squint at the name and photo. "Thank you," he said, stepping back like he just defused a bomb. "Appreciate your cooperation." "It's not cooperation when I didn't have a choice," Darius replied flatly. As the crew retreated, a few passengers resumed their conversations, pretending they hadn't been watching, pretending they weren't participating in the quiet complicity of looking away. But not everyone. From across the aisle, a man in a khaki vest and loafers leaned over, his voice low but sharp. "They shouldn't have to go through all that just to prove who they are," he said, not unkindly, but not exactly supportive either. "You know, with all the fraud these days, you can't be too careful." Darius turned slowly. "Are you implying I used someone else's ticket?" "Hey," the man said, raising his hands. "Just making an observation." "You looked a little surprised when they asked. That's all." "Surprised?" Darius echoed. "No, not surprised, tired." "Well," the man added, "it's not like it's unheard of. These first-class types, they get pretty strict about who they let up front, even in the premium section. It's not meant to be for just anyone, you know." "I see," Darius said, his voice low. "And what exactly am I? Then anyone, don't twist my word, friend," the man said, smiling tightly. "Just saying you don't look like the usual crowd up there. You don't give off that legacy vibe." "Legacy," Darius repeated, resisting the urge to laugh. "What you mean is, I don't look like the people you're used to seeing in power." The words still echoed in Darius's mind, long after the man across the aisle leaned back, smug and silent, convinced he had said something reasonable. Legacy. The weight of that word had pressed against Darius's chest like a boot, not because it was new, but because of how easily it was weaponized. How quickly people like that man could package prejudice inside polite phrasing and expect you to swallow it with a thank you. Darius sat still for a long time after, that eyes fixed on the blank screen in front of him, but his thoughts were burning sharp and strategic. He'd built Langston Dynamics from the ground up in an industry that was all gates and gatekeepers, and he'd done it without bending the knee to anyone who tried to decide where he belonged. And now, on this plane among these strangers, they decided again that he didn't belong. The difference was they had no idea just how wrong they were. Still, there was a process to war. Even calculated fury needed form. Darius straightened his posture and pressed the call button. It took nearly 5 minutes for anyone to respond. When someone finally approached, it wasn't Curtis or Linda. It was a new face, a young brunette woman with careful posture and a name tag that read, Carla. She smiled stiffly, clearly bracing for confrontation. "Yes, sir?" she asked. Darius didn't bother matching her tone. "I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant," he said evenly. Carla blinked. "May I ask the nature of your request?" "You may," he replied. "I want an explanation for why I've been subjected to treatment inconsistent with the rest of this cabin repeatedly, including unlawful ID verification, damaged property, and strategic seat displacement." Carla shifted, suddenly unsure of her role in the hierarchy she'd walked into. One moment she said quietly, then disappeared toward the front. 10 minutes passed. Darius kept his eyes forward. He refused to fidget, refused to check his watch, refused to look like the man they expected him to be. Agitated, loud, unstable. When Carla returned, it was with a different attendant. Older red lipstick, stern jawline blazer, one shade darker than the rest. Her name tag read Heather. "She didn't smile, Mr. Langston," she said, standing in the aisle. "I understand you have concerns. I have formal grievances," he corrected. "And I requested a discussion with the lead." Heather's mouth twitched. "I'm the cabin supervisor on this flight. Then let's talk." "I don't believe that's necessary," she said flatly. Our records show that your seat was reassigned due to a last-minute priority override, and all subsequent actions taken by the crew have been in accordance with safety procedures and company policy, which policy permits identity checks for a confirmed ticket holder without cause. He asked, "Which clause justifies the intentional damage to my equipment?" "Sir." Heather said, her tone now curt. "We are not obligated to engage further with passengers who refuse to comply with seat assignments and operational adjustments issued by the airline." There it was, legal armor polished to deflect accountability. Darius studied her, not blinking, so to clarify, he said, voice precise. "I complied with every order issued, endured each reassignment, submitted to unjustified documentation checks, and I'm now being told the airline reserves the right to silence me." "That's not what I said," she replied quickly. "But that's exactly what you meant." Before Heather could respond, a soft voice nearby cut in. "Well, what do you expect?" The voice came from behind, half-whispered sharp. A woman in her early 40s leaned toward the aisle, speaking to no one in particular but loud enough to be heard. People like that think watching a few movies about rich guys in suits means they can just walk into first class like they belong there. A few heads turned. No one corrected her. No one flinched. Heather didn't react. She simply smoothed her skirt and folded her arms. Darius turned his head slowly. His gaze met the woman's. "People? Like what exactly?" he asked. She blinked, then smirked. "Oh, come on. You know what I mean." "Say it out loud," he said. "If you're going to degrade someone in public, at least have the courage to use complete sentences." The smirk faltered. Heather stepped in. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to lower your voice." "Why?" he asked. "Because someone finally said the quiet part out loud." "This isn't a debate," Heather snapped. "No, Darius said it's a pattern and you're all part of it." Silence fell heavy and awkward. Even those who had pretended to sleep were now alert. Darius's voice was steady, his words deliberate. "You've taken my seat. You've soaked my property. You've questioned my right to be here, and now you're shielding someone who's insulted me for nothing more than existing in the wrong row. At what point does this stop being an adjustment and start being exactly what it is?" Heather's eyes flicked to Carla, escort him back to his seat. Carla didn't move. Darius stood before she could. "No need," he said. "I'll return myself." He tapped the screen, holding it to his ear. Voice, low but firm. "Quinn priority flag, send full log extraction seat reassignment history, cabin manifest change crew roster, get me contact at the FAA if needed. Something's building here, and I don't want to miss the inflection point." There was a pause, and then a clipped professional reply. "Understood. Activating now." Darius ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, and leaned his head against the headrest for a brief moment, but peace, as expected, was fleeting. Less than a minute passed before footsteps approached, sharp, fast, purposeful. It was Heather again, her lips tight, her eyes narrowed, not with concern but with manufactured authority. "Sir," she began, her tone sharp. "You are not permitted to use unauthorized communication devices on board once we've reached cruising altitude." Darius didn't blink. "This device is fully compliant. It's encrypted and silent. No Wi-Fi, no interference." You can verify that Heather hesitated, caught off guard by the specificity, then tried another approach. "Regardless, your behavior has become disruptive. Other passengers have expressed discomfort. If this continues, we'll have no choice but to consider you a threat to flight integrity." Darius stared. At her? "Let me get this straight. I've sat quietly in my seat, asked for accountability, and made one lawful phone call, and that makes me a threat. Security protocols are broad for a reason," she snapped. "We can't take chances with non-compliant passengers." Darius gave a soft, humorless laugh. "You're not enforcing safety," he said. "You're enforcing discomfort." "Sir, this is your final warning," Heather replied. "If you continue to escalate, escalate." He cut in, voice low but unmistakably still. "You think this is escalation. You haven't seen escalation." Her jaw clenched. If you won't cooperate, we'll involve the captain. I encourage it, he said calmly. In fact, I insist. Heather turned on her heel and disappeared down the aisle heels, clipping against the floor like a retreating verdict. But before Darius could exhale, another figure passed by, a man in pilot blues, younger, cocky, the glint of silver wings still fresh on his chest. He didn't stop, didn't even make eye contact. But as he walked past Darius's row, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Darius to hear. Doesn't surprise me. First class is too easy to fake these days. Flash a smile, drop a name, and they let anyone through. The words hit like a blade, not because they were new, but because of how casually they were delivered, how freely. Contempt slipped from his mouth like idle gossip. Darius turned his head slowly, watching the pilot vanish behind the cockpit door. And for the first time since boarding, he felt it. Not rage, not even humiliation, but something colder, cleaner resolve. He knew that voice, knew that attitude, knew exactly what it meant when institutions built on rules started bending those rules selectively around him. The murmur of passengers resumed, some pretending to be lost in their tablets, others stealing glances through the corners of their eyes. The cabin had become its own courtroom, its own theater, and Darius, by design or fate, had been cast as both defendant and prosecution. A few rows behind him, someone whispered the words, "troublemaker." Another added, should have known Darius didn't move. He didn't need to, because what none of them realized was that they were no longer in control of the story. They had made their assumptions spoken, their lines, played their parts. But Darius Langston had just flipped the script. Quietly, deliberately, he opened a secure app on his phone, entered a passcode, and activated an internal trigger. Silent, instantaneous Langston Dynamics Internal Affairs Division would now begin real-time monitoring of the flight via satellite sync. Public behavior tracking and audio logs were available. Evidence was being gathered, records were being compiled. And more, importantly, systems were already in motion to pull every string required, legal, corporate, reputational. This plane wasn't just moving through airspace anymore. It was moving toward a reckoning. Darius exhaled slowly, the weight on his shoulders shifting from suppression to control. The fastened seatbelt sign had just turned off and the service carts began moving again, pushed by attendants who wore politeness like armor and flash smiles that had no root in sincerity. Darius kept his eyes forward as the cart approached his row manned by Curtis, whose sleeves were now rolled to his forearms, revealing a perfectly timed watch and the kind of tan that spoke of country clubs and inherited vacation homes, meal service. Sir Curtis asked without enthusiasm, not meeting Darius's gaze, chicken pasta or vegetarian pasta. Darius said voice. Even Curtis didn't move. He reached into the cart, paused, then turned his head slightly. Actually, we've run out. Then the chicken, Darius replied without missing a beat. We're down to one reserved for a medical request in row 5. Darius didn't blink. Vegetarian apologies. Curtis said, his tone now almost cheerful. That tray was compromised during turbulence earlier. Safety protocol prevents us from serving it. Darius looked at the man, silently measuring him. So you're telling me, he said slowly, that after serving the entire forward section and rows 1 through 9, the only seat on this plane without access to a meal is mine. Curtis finally looked him in the eye and smiled faintly. Seems that way. He moved on before Darius could respond, leaving behind only the faint clink of silverware and the smell of warm food, a scent that now felt like mockery. Across the aisle, a man leaned over his tray, slicing into his chicken breast with practiced precision. He wore a navy blazer with a lapel pin shaped like a flag, and his phone, resting face up on his tray, displayed a financial news app streaming market updates. Without turning, he spoke. You know, he said casually, you could have avoided All this, if you just sat where they told you, Darius didn't respond. The man took another bite, chewed, swallowed, then continued. It's always the same story. Someone makes a fuss, tries to push their way to the top, and then cries foul when they get pushed back. Still, Darius said nothing, but I get it. The man added, "You think making noise forces respect? Problem is, respect's earned, not shouted for." Darius turned his head slowly. "You have something to say. Say it clearly." The man smiled, not kindly. "I'm just saying you might be more comfortable in a cabin that fits your background. That's not an insult, it's an observation." "No," Darius said, voice measured. "What you're doing is framing your discomfort with my presence as logic so you can feel righteous while staying ignorant." "It's not ignorance," the man replied smoothly. "It's structure. Some people try to take what doesn't belong to them and pretend it's progress, and others inherit what they didn't earn and pretend it's merit," Darius said. "Which one are you, the—" Man's jaw stiffened. He picked up his napkin, dabbed the corner of his mouth, then muttered, "That's the problem with this generation. Everything's about race now." "No," Darius replied. "Everything's always been about race. You're just not used to being called out on it." Before the man could respond, a woman 2 rows ahead turned slightly, casting a sharp look over her shoulder. "Can you both keep it down? Some of us are trying to enjoy what we paid for." "You mean the silence?" Darius asked, leaning forward. "Or the eraser?" She rolled her eyes. "Whatever drama you brought with you, leave it out of the aisle." And just like that, the illusion snapped back into place, the kind where everyone around pretends neutrality is noble, where silence becomes complicity, and where the one who dares to resist becomes the villain for disrupting the quiet. Darius leaned back in his seat and clasped his hands, feeling every muscle in his body coiled tighter. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt precision. Every insult, every slight, every denial was now a numbered item in a ledger. His expression didn't change, but behind his eyes the lines were being drawn carefully, quietly, and without mercy. His attention had shifted inward, where every offense had now become part of a silent ledger, and that ledger had finally reached its limit. He reached into his pocket, retrieved the secure phone, sleek matte black, coded only for executive-level communication within his enterprise, and unlocked it with a single fingerprint. The screen lit up, revealing no apps, just one contact encrypted and blinking. He tapped it. There was no greeting when the call connected, no pleasantries. He spoke just 7 words, each one deliberate, each one detonating with quiet force. "Activate protocol B13. They've crossed the line." Then he ended the call. No explanation, no tone, no need. Within seconds, somewhere deep in the corporate towers of Langston Dynamics, a chain reaction began. Legal, internal security, media strategy, and executive response, all synchronized into motion. Just as they had been programmed to under specific triggers, Darius returned the phone to his pocket and resumed his silence. But now he was no longer simply enduring, he was controlling. Across the plane. Nothing seemed to change on the surface. Passengers continued their in-flight rituals, oblivious to what had been set in motion. But in the cockpit, a silent alert blinked on the co-pilot's panel. Red unusual classified. The co-pilot glanced at it, then leaned toward the captain. "Priority escalation flag," he said. "From corporate. We've got a call coming in. Level 6 override." The captain, a seasoned man with gray streaks at his temples and a decade's worth of calm under pressure, frowned as he tapped his headset. "Flight 849, this is Captain Rowan. Go ahead." A moment of silence, then a voice came through. Not FAA, not air traffic. It was internal operations from Skylinks Airlines, but not from operations control. This came from the private executive line. "Captain, you are instructed to initiate internal compliance. Audit mid-flight, effective immediately. This is a direct order under new ownership protocol. You are to open secure file tag LDNB13. Immediate briefing required." Rowan blinked new ownership copy. The voice replied, You'll find the documentation in your secure terminal open. Now Rowan turned to his co-pilot fingers flying across the console. A moment later, a file appeared on the small embedded screen labeled Confidential Executive Authorization, Langston Acquisition Confirmed. Beneath that header was a photo of Darius Langston, owner-CEO. As of 3 weeks ago, he held controlling interest in Skylink's holdings, which now included this flight, this aircraft, this staff. Rowan leaned back, breath shallow. "Get the lead attendant," he muttered. Now within 2 minutes, Heather was summoned to the cockpit, her expression tight as she entered. "Captain, is there a problem?" Rowan turned to her slowly, the secure tablet still glowing in his lap. "Why don't you tell me, Heather?" Her brow furrowed. "Sir, the gentleman in seat 10D, he said evenly. "Were there any incidents?" Heather hesitated, then chose neutrality. "He's been difficult. There were some seating discrepancies. He refused to comply. He refused." Rowan raised an eyebrow because from where I'm sitting, he owns this aircraft. Heather froze, "Sir, that's not possible. It's confirmed." Rowan said, "As of 3 weeks ago, Mr. Darius Langston is the primary shareholder of this airline. He holds veto rights over crew operations, including your status on this flight." The blood drained from Heather's face. "I didn't know. He never said he didn't have to." Rowan cut in. "And that's the point." Heather opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Rowan's voice softened, but it held no sympathy. "I'd suggest you return to the cabin, inform your crew discreetly, and begin correcting the narrative before it reaches the media team. He undoubtedly activated 20 minutes ago." "Yes, sir," she said, voice barely audible. As she exited the cockpit, her steps shaky, her mind reeled back over every choice made, every cold word spoken, every smirk she had allowed. The man they had treated like a problem wasn't a problem. He was the future of the company that signed her checks. The moment Heather reached his row, she paused. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because for the first time she understood who she was speaking to. He looked up, calm, precise, waiting. "Mr. Langston." She began, her voice lacking the sharp edge it once carried. "The captain has asked if you'd like to visit the forward cabin at your discretion. He's made arrangements for a full debrief per executive compliance procedure." Darius studied her for a moment, then stood adjusting the lapels of his blazer with quiet purpose. "Thank you," he said. His voice was smooth, not condescending, not vindictive, but it carried weight now, and the sudden hush that followed proved it. As he walked up the aisle, the energy in the cabin changed. Heads turned. The woman 2 rows ahead, the one who had told him to stop bringing drama, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her cheeks flushed. The man across the aisle, still scrolling his financial app, lowered his screen slightly, watching as Darius passed. Now seeing him not as an inconvenience, but as something else entirely authority. When Darius reached the cockpit door, it opened before he could knock. Captain Rowan stood tall, face composed, but lined with the knowledge of exactly what this moment represented. "Mr. Langston," he said respectfully, stepping aside, "welcome." Darius entered the forward cabin, a space normally reserved for critical systems and locked doors, but today it became a boardroom at 3500 FT. He accepted the digital pad from the captain, unlocked it with a proprietary gesture code, and displayed the real symbol of power in the air, the Langston Dynamics Executive Override Clearance. A glowing blue sigil marked Executive Tier 1, access effective immediately. Darius began his tone calm and formal. "You are instructed to initiate post-landing detainment of the following personnel pending internal audit: Heather Carson, Curtis Fields, and Linda Reyes. A full transcript of crew-to-passenger interactions has been flagged for review under code LDN14. The captain nodded. "Acknowledged. I'll be deplaning through the service hatch once we arrive." Darius added, "Have ground operations redirect the media feed. We'll be issuing a statement." "Understood," Rowan replied, then hesitated. "Sir, I apologize for how this was handled." Darius looked at him. Not cold, not even angry, just resolute. It wasn't just handled poorly. He said it was systemic, and with that he turned and exited the cockpit, walking the same aisle. He had been humiliated in just 2 hours earlier. But now every step was quiet thunder. Passengers straightened as he passed. Some lowered their eyes, others whispered. The tension that had once pushed him down now bent in his direction like gravity realigned. When he reached his seat again, he didn't sit. He stood calmly beside it, speaking into his second device in a tone barely above a murmur. Legal. He said, prepare, public release, understatement. Package C, include video logs from cabin feed. Timestamp at 34 minutes after takeoff. Use phrasing ownership present, leadership engaged, policy failure acknowledged, distribute to press outlets starting with Forbes, then CNBC, then Tech Insider, a pause. Then he added, make sure this isn't a headline, make it a standard. Behind him, Heather had returned to the galley. She didn't speak, didn't move. Her hands were clasped too tightly, her breathing just a shade too fast. Curtis leaned against a cabinet nearby, arms crossed, but his confidence had dissolved into a rigid, silent stillness. Only Linda remained seated in the jump seat, eyes wide and unfocused, as though trying to process the sudden shift in hierarchy, the sheer velocity of the reversal. The rest of the crew avoided eye contact. The plane wasn't the same anymore. The man they had ridiculed now held the authority to rewrite their careers. Yet Darius didn't revel in it. He didn't gloat or retaliate. He merely documented, recorded, ordered. He was exact. He was cold. He was everything they hadn't expected someone like him to be. And that was the real punishment, because power wielded without fury often cuts the deepest minutes. Later, the captain's voice filled the cabin, unusually formal. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent. Please return your seats to the upright position and secure your belongings. We thank you for your cooperation. But this time, the message landed differently. Every person on board now understood that the world outside that fuselage was no longer the same as the one they had departed from. Passengers, who had once whispered snide remarks or cast suspicious glances, now fidgeted in their seats, unsure whether to look forward or down, unsure if they would be asked to answer for their silence. Up front, the captain's voice returned, composed and weighted with corporate precision. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles International Airport. We ask that all passengers remain seated. There will be a brief hold prior to deplaning due to coordination with airport authorities. Thank you for your patience. The words were carefully chosen differential. Cautious, calculated, Darius Langston remained standing, one hand resting on the back of his seat, his expression unchanged. But beneath that still surface, a storm of systems was already unfolding before the wheels had even stopped rolling. Skylinx's Executive Oversight Division had received and distributed Darius's compliance report. Within 10 minutes of touchdown, the tarmac outside was lined with black SUVs bearing the discreet insignia of Langston Dynamics Internal Ethics Task Force and Corporate Audit Team. For senior officers waited in dark suits under the California sun tablets, in hand eyes trained on the descending jet bridge. Inside, Heather was pale, visibly trembling, staring blankly into the reflective glass of the jump seat's cabinet. Curtis stood behind her, arms stiff at his sides, his jaw clenched so hard it seemed locked. Linda had gone silent long ago, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes blinking too often as if replaying every decision from the past 6 hours in slow motion. Cabin doors to arrival and cross-check came the first officer's call. With that, the door opened to a very different welcome than the crew had expected. The lead compliance officer stepped in, first tall, composed, his voice clipped and precise. Heather Carson Curtis. Fields. Linda Reyes. By order of the Executive Board, you are hereby relieved of duty pending immediate administrative review. You will accompany us to the corporate field office. Failure to comply will result in summary termination under Clause 7A. A gasp rippled through the nearby passengers. Heather stood slowly, her lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. She knew the code. She knew Clause 7A. It wasn't just suspension. It was a direct trigger for a formal misconduct investigation, one that in a high-profile case like this would go beyond HR and straight to the Public Ethics Board. "This is a mistake," Curtis muttered. He never even said who he was. He didn't have to. The officer said, "Your job was to follow policy, not guess pedigree." "I didn't mean," Linda began, but her voice faltered. The officer raised a hand. "Everything from this point forward will be recorded and entered into your review transcripts. I suggest you speak only to your counsel." The crew was escorted off the aircraft one by one, not in handcuffs, not in shame, but in silence that felt louder than any siren. The passengers parted instinctively as they passed, some averting their eyes, others watching with undisguised fascination. Retribution was no longer abstract. It was visible, undeniable, unfolding, step by step down the center aisle. Darius remained still. He hadn't moved from his position, hadn't spoken a single word since the wheels hit the ground. He didn't need to. Power didn't always arrive with sound. Sometimes it arrived with structure. A few minutes later, another executive officer stepped on board and approached Darius directly. "Sir, the boardroom has issued full authorization to proceed. All data, crew, records, and passenger statements have been secured. We've initiated internal audit protocol." Darius nodded once. "Public timeline, press embargo until tomorrow morning," the man replied. "But leaks are inevitable. We've preceded official language with media outlets. You'll lead the press briefing remotely from headquarters. A representative team is waiting in the terminal if you'd like to make an appearance." "Not yet," Darius said. "Let them sit with the silence first." The man nodded and stepped away. As Darius turned toward the cabin, he scanned the faces that had hours earlier looked at him with judgment, discomfort, even ridicule. Now those same faces were full of quiet uncertainty. Some passengers gave him a nod, respectful but cautious. Others looked away, unsure how to reconcile the man they had dismissed with the man who now stood above them all. The terminal buzzed with the usual noise of arrivals and announcements. But within the executive wing of LAX, a different kind of quiet, settled, calm, composed, intentional. Darius Langston stood by the wide pane of glass overlooking the tarmac, his reflection superimposed over the plane he had just disembarked. Behind him, voices from his legal team murmured updates and schedules. Screens flickered with live statements being prepared for the morning media run. And yet, in the stillness of that moment, Darius remained centered. This wasn't about damage control. It was about redirection, about ensuring the weight of what had happened would be channeled into something more than corporate reprimands or fleeting headlines. It needed roots. It needed reform. And just as he turned toward the private corridor leading to his car, a soft voice called out from behind. "Mr. Langston." He paused, glanced over his shoulder and saw a young woman, early 20s, light brown curls, pulled into a neat bun uniform, slightly wrinkled eyes filled with something too complex to be labeled fear or guilt. Her name tag read Grace. He remembered her. She had stood silent near the service station during the meal service, her gaze downcast as Curtis lied and Heather smirked, her body language screaming discomfort while her lips said nothing. Now she stood straighter, though her hands trembled slightly. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me," she said quickly, "but I couldn't leave without saying something." Darius gave a slight nod, his expression open, but guarded. "I saw everything." Grace continued. "I didn't say anything, and I've been thinking about that every second since we landed. I was scared of losing my job, of being pulled into it, but that's not an excuse. It was cowardice." Darius didn't interrupt. He let the silence do the work. Grace swallowed. I know you're launching that internal reform program, Airborne Equity, right? I read about it on the news feed, the training, the accountability board, the community mentorships. I want to help. I want to do something better than just regret. Darius studied her carefully. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She stood there, not for absolution, but for permission to change, to act, to start again. "You'll receive a message from my team," he said after a moment. "There's a pilot program starting next quarter. If you're serious, you'll be part of it." Grace's eyes widened with something close to disbelief. "Thank you. Truly," he offered the faintest smile. "We don't need perfect allies," he said, "just brave ones." She nodded, then stepped back, her posture firmer than before. As she disappeared into the terminal crowd, Darius turned again, this time heading toward the private elevator that would take him down to the reserved fleet below. But his steps slowed as he passed one of the large monitors displaying news alerts. There, on the live crawl beneath a headline about the airline incident, ran a subcaption: "Former Skylinks crew manager releases public statement following dismissal." Curious Darius stepped closer, tapped the audio feed into his earpiece, and listened. It was Heather's voice, shaky, stripped of its authority, but clear. "My name is Heather Carson. I was the lead flight attendant on Flight 849. I was terminated yesterday following a corporate review into my conduct, and I want to say something not because I was told to, but because it's overdue." Her voice cracked, but she continued. "I was wrong. I operated from assumption, from comfort, from inherited bias. I didn't question. And in doing so, I harmed someone who deserved my service, not my suspicion. I watched the tapes, I saw myself. I was not who I thought I was, and that truth has changed me." There was a pause, and then a new setting appeared. A modest building in South LA, a banner hanging above it reading "Community Flight Initiative," sponsored by Langston Dynamics. Heather sat on the front steps now in casual clothes, her eyes softer aged by humility. "I asked to volunteer here to work with kids who dream of flying but don't see anyone who looks like them in the cockpit. I don't know if it's enough, but it's a beginning." Darius stood quietly for a long moment, then tapped the earpiece off. He didn't need to hear more. That was the kind of ripple effect he wanted. Not compliance, not appeasement, but transformation. Back at the elevator, his lead assistant approached with a tablet. "Sir Press is on standby. Boardroom is ready. Do you want to prep talking points?" Darius shook his head. "No, we don't control this moment with words. Let the actions speak." The elevator. Doors opened. He stepped inside. As they closed, the last thing he saw was a father holding his son near the glass, pointing at a jet outside. The boy's eyes full of wonder. That was the future. That was who this had been for. And finally, the man they all tried to erase was now the reason change had landed. Permanent, deliberate, and just beginning.